The morning air in Port Haven, Oregon, always smelled of salt and damp cedar. For Claire, it was the smell of safety. She stood on the porch of her small, weathered cottage, a mug of black coffee steaming in her hands. She watched the fog roll off the Pacific, thick and gray, swallowing the jagged rocks along the shoreline. For 12 years, this had been her life, quiet, predictable, and remarkably ordinary. In town, people knew Claire as the woman who ran the local community center's youth fitness program and spent her weekends fixing up old wooden boats. She was polite, but kept to herself. She didn't have social media. She didn't talk about where she came from. And she certainly never mentioned the scars on her shoulder or the way she could take apart a zimus in total darkness and two in total darkness. To the residents of Port Haven, she was just Claire, a woman who liked her privacy and ran 5 miles every morning at a pace that seemed a bit too fast for a hobbyist. That morning, her run took her along the cliffside trail. Her boots hit the dirt with a steady, rhythmic thud. Most people listened to music or podcasts while they ran. But Claire listened to the world. She heard the shift in the wind, the distant cry of a gull, and the crunch of gravel behind her. She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She just slowed to a walk, her heart rate barely elevated despite the incline. Someone was following her. They weren't doing a very good job of hiding it, which meant they wanted to be noticed. Or, more likely, they knew she would notice anyway. Claire didn't head back to her cottage. Instead, she took a detour toward the harbor, weaving through the morning crowd of fishermen unloading crates of crab. She caught her reflection in a shop window. At 38, she looked fit, but her face had the kind of stillness that only comes from seeing things most people only see in movies. She tucked a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear and kept moving. By noon, she was back at the community center. She spent 3 hours teaching a group of middle schoolers how to climb a rope and run an obstacle course. "You're like a ninja, Miss Claire," one of the boys said, breathless, after she demonstrated a pull-up transition. Claire gave a small, rare smile. "Just practice, Tommy. Keep your core tight." But as she spoke, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It didn't belong in Port Haven. It was too clean, the windows too dark. It sat there, idling, for an hour. A cold knot formed in her stomach. 12 years. She had given them 12 years of silence. She had vanished into the civilian world, changed her name, and buried her service record so deep they might as well have been at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. When she finished her shift, she didn't go straight home. She went to the hardware store, bought a box of nails she didn't need, and watched the street through the reflection of a display of power tools. The sedan followed her at a distance. She finally pulled into a driveway as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The sedan stopped at the end of her gravel road. Claire didn't go inside her house. She walked to the center of her yard, stood by the old oak tree, and waited. The car door opened. A man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a faded navy blue sweatshirt and jeans, but he walked with the rigid posture of someone who had spent 40 years in a uniform. "You're a hard woman to find, Chief," the man said. His voice was like sandpaper. Claire felt a jolt at the title. Chief. She hadn't been called that since she was 26, standing on the deck of a transport ship in the middle of the night. "I wasn't trying to be found, Admiral Vance," Claire replied, her voice steady. The man, Admiral Robert Vance, no relation, though they often joked about it during her active years, walked closer. He stopped 10 feet away, respecting her space. He knew better than to surprise her. "I know you weren't, and I wouldn't be here if it weren't a matter of national security." Actually, it's more personal than that. It's about the team. Claire looked away toward the ocean. I don't have a team. I haven't had a team since the Red Sea. I'm a gym teacher now, Robert. I fix boats. I don't do whatever it is you're here for. The technology you helped retrieve in Operation Nightfall, Vance said, ignoring her protest. The physical encryption modules. Do you remember where the third one was hidden? Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. Operation Nightfall had been a black mission. She was one of the few women ever attached to a SEAL unit for specialized maritime intelligence and extraction. They had been ghosts. It was destroyed, Claire said. That's what the report said, Vance countered. But we both know you were the one who carried it out of the facility. The digital records are gone, Claire. Someone wiped the servers from the inside. But the physical backup, the one you were supposed to dispose of, we think it's still out there. And the people who wiped the servers are looking for it. Why come to me? She asked. Because everyone else on that extraction team is either dead or compromised, Vance said quietly. You're the only one left who isn't on the grid. You're the only one I can trust. He stepped forward and held out a small encrypted tablet. On the screen was a grainy satellite image of a wreckage site in international waters. 3 days ago, a research vessel was hijacked, Vance explained. They aren't looking for oil or gold. They're looking for the module. If they get it, they can unlock every deep cover identity in the Pacific theater. Thousands of lives, Claire. People like you who moved on. They'll be hunted. Claire looked at the tablet, then at her quiet cottage. Inside, there was a half-finished book on her nightstand and a loaf of bread on the counter. It was the life she had fought for. A life without shadows, without the weight of a rifle, without the constant mourning for friends lost to the sea. I'm out of practice, she lied. Vance looked at her hands, rough, calloused, and rock-steady. I saw you on the trail this morning. You're faster now than you were at 24. The Navy doesn't just want your memory, Claire. We need your hands. We need the person who knows those waters better than anyone. He left the tablet on the hood of her old truck. There's a transport leaving from the regional airfield at midnight. If you're not on it, I'll understand. You've given enough. But if you don't come, nobody else is coming to save those people. He turned and walked back to his car. Claire watched the red taillights disappear into the fog. She stood in the dark for a long time. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. She went inside, but she didn't turn on the lights. She walked to the kitchen and moved the heavy refrigerator away from the wall. Behind it was a loose floorboard. She pried it up. Inside was a vacuum-sealed bag. She tore it open. It wasn't full of money or passports. It held a pair of worn tactical boots, a specialized diving watch, and a small silver coin with a trident on it. She picked up the coin. Her thumb traced the metal. The piece she had spent 12 years building felt suddenly fragile, like glass. She realized she couldn't stay in Port Haven and watch the news, waiting to see the names of her former colleagues appear in the obituaries. She grabbed a duffel bag and began to pack. She didn't take much, just the essentials. As she walked out the door, she didn't lock it. In her mind, she was already miles away, feeling the cold pressure of the deep ocean calling her back. The gym teacher was gone. The chief was back. The regional airfield was a strip of cracked asphalt surrounded by tall pines. At midnight, it was pitch black, save for the dim blue taxiway lights. Claire sat in her truck with the engine off, watching a sleek, unmarked transport plane hiss as its engines cooled. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. For 12 years, she had looked into these eyes and seen a teacher. Now she saw a soldier. It was a cold, unsettling feeling, like putting on a coat that was too tight but strangely familiar. She grabbed her duffel bag and stepped out. The air was freezing, but she didn't shiver. Her body was already adjusting, entering a state of high alert she thought she had suppressed forever. As she approached the plane, the cargo ramp lowered. Admiral Vance stood there, looking at his watch. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease just a fraction. "I wasn't sure you'd show," he said over the whine of the auxiliary power unit. "I'm not here for the Navy," Claire replied, walking past him into the belly of the plane. "I'm here for the people on that list." The flight was long and mostly silent. They flew over the Pacific, crossing time zones until the sun rose and set again. Vance spent the time briefing her on the new guard. The team she would be joining wasn't a standard unit. They were younger, faster, and used technology that Claire had only read about. They were currently stationed on a carrier off the coast of the Philippines. When the transport finally touched down on the deck of the USS Enterprise, the heat hit Claire like a physical wall. The flight deck was a chaos of screaming jet engines and shouting sailors. She felt a strange surge of adrenaline. The smell of jet fuel and salt air was the scent of her 20s. Vance led her through a maze of narrow, steel corridors to a briefing room deep in the ship's hull. Inside, 4 people were gathered around a digital map table. They were young, probably in their mid-20s, and they looked like they were carved out of granite. "Team," Vance said, his voice commanding the room. "This is Claire. She's the primary advisor for Operation Deep Reach." The room went silent. A tall man with a shaved head and a tattoo of a compass on his forearm stepped forward. He looked Claire up and down with a skeptical squint. "An advisor? Admiral, with all respect, we were told we're heading into a high-risk dive recovery. Is this the specialist?" "She's the one who mapped the sector 12 years ago," Vance said firmly. "She knows the terrain better than the satellites do." The man, whose call sign was Jax, didn't look convinced. 12 years is a long time, ma'am. The ocean changes. Tech changes. 12 years is a long time, ma'am. The ocean changes. Tech changes. We use liquid breathing systems and AI-assisted navigation now. It's not exactly the old-school way." Claire didn't get angry. She didn't need to. She walked up to the digital table and looked at the topographic map of the seafloor. She saw a specific ridge near the target site. "You're right, Jax," she said, her voice calm and low. "The ocean changes. But that thermal vent at 400 meters? It creates a blind spot for sonar every 6 hours because of the mineral discharge. If you use your AI-assisted navigation there, the signal will bounce and you'll drive your $1 million submersible straight into a rock wall. I don't need a computer to tell me that. I remember the sound of the pressure against the hull." The team exchanged looks. The skepticism was still there, but it was edged with a new layer of curiosity. The next morning, they hit the water for a calibration dive. It was supposed to be a simple exercise to see if Claire could handle the modern gear. They were in a training tank on the ship, a massive, deep pool designed to simulate high-pressure environments. Claire looked at the new diving suit. It was thinner, stronger, and more complex than anything she had ever worn. As she strapped on the helmet, she felt a momentary flash of claustrophobia. For a second, she was back in the Red Sea, trapped in a sinking cabin with the water rising to her chin. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Breathe," she told herself. Box breathing. 4 seconds in. 4 seconds hold. 4 seconds out. She submerged. The water closed over her and the world went quiet. Jax and the others were already at the bottom, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who lived in the water. They were performing a series of complex tasks, assembling a mock recovery device while fighting an artificial current. Claire watched them. They were good, but they were robotic. They relied entirely on their heads-up displays, HUDs. When the instructor suddenly cut the lights in the tank to simulate a power failure, the younger divers froze. Their HUDs went dark, and for a few seconds they were blind. Claire didn't hesitate. She didn't need the lights. She had spent years diving in silt-heavy rivers and pitch-black bays where you couldn't see your own hand. She moved by feel. She felt the vibration of the water, the direction of the current, and the weight of the objects around her. In the total darkness, she swam to the assembly point. She felt the metal parts, snapping them into place by memory. By the time the emergency lights flickered on, the device was half finished, and Claire was hovering perfectly still in the center of the tank, her eyes calm. When they broke the surface, the team was silent. Jax pulled off his mask, looking at Claire with a mix of confusion and newfound respect. "How did you find the latch in the dark?" he asked. "My sensors were totally jammed." "Close your eyes next time," Claire said, wiping water from her face. "The tech is a tool, not a brain. If you can't do it blind, you shouldn't be doing it at all." That evening, the mood changed. They weren't just the team and the teacher anymore. They sat in the mess hall, and for the first time, they asked her questions. Not about tech, but about survival. They wanted to know how she had stayed hidden for 12 years. "I just chose to be someone else," she told them. "But the problem with the past is that it's like a buoy. You can try to push it underwater and hold it there, but the moment you let go, it's going to pop right back to the surface." Just then, a red light began to pulse in the hallway. A siren wailed short, sharp bursts. Vance appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Change of plans. The research vessel we were tracking just sent out a distress signal, but it wasn't a call for help. It was a warning. The mercenary group, the ones looking for the module, they've reached the site ahead of schedule. They aren't just looking for the data anymore. They've started mining the area with deep-sea explosives to keep anyone else away." The team stood up instantly. The playfulness was gone. "We're going in tonight," Rance said, looking directly at Claire. "We don't have time for more practice. This is a hot extraction. Claire, you're leading the navigation. Jax, you're on point. Get to the hangar." As Claire grabbed her gear, her hand brushed against the silver coin in her pocket. The quiet life in Port Haven felt like a dream she had had a long time ago. She realized then that she hadn't just been hiding from the Navy for 12 years. She had been waiting for them to find her. The ramp of the transport helicopter lowered, and they stepped out into the humid night. The mission was no longer a theoretical exercise. Somewhere beneath the black waves of the South China Sea, the secrets she had tried to bury were waiting. And so were the people willing to kill for them. The helicopter ride was a blur of vibrating steel and shouting voices. Claire sat tucked into the corner of the transport, the heavy weight of her diving rig pressing against her chest. To her left, Jax was obsessively checking his oxygen seals. Across from her, the other team members, a quiet guy they called Stone and a tech specialist named Reed, were staring at a flickering holographic map. They were heading toward a coordinate in the middle of the ocean, where a massive underwater ridge rose up like a jagged tooth from the sea floor. The mission was simple on paper, but a nightmare in reality. They had to drop into the water 3 miles out to avoid radar, swim to the site of the sunken research vessel, and locate the physical encryption module before the mercenaries could blast it out of the wreckage. "We drop in 5, the pilot yelled. Claire felt the familiar tightening in her throat. It wasn't fear, it was focus. She looked at Jax. He was staring at her, his eyes asking a silent question. He was the team leader, but in this environment he knew he was a tourist. She was the local. "Listen up," Claire said, her voice cutting through the roar of the rotors. The team leaned in. "Once we hit the water, we go silent. No lights until we reach the hull. The current is going to pull you toward the east ridge. Don't fight it. Ride it, then cut across the thermal vent. If you fight the water, you'll burn your oxygen in 20 minutes. Let the ocean do the work. Jax nodded, tapping his helmet. You heard her. Follow her lead. The jump was a shock to the system. One moment Claire was in the humid, oil-scented cabin. The next, she was falling into a black abyss. She hit the water feet first, the cold Pacific slamming into her like a wall of concrete. She sank deep, the bubbles roaring past her ears until she stabilized and adjusted her buoyancy. She looked up. 3 dark shapes followed her down. They swam in a tight formation. The ocean at night is a different world. It's a place of shadows and strange rhythmic sounds. As they descended, the pressure began to build. Claire felt it in her joints, a familiar ache she hadn't felt in over a decade. It felt like coming home. As they approached the underwater ridge, the blind spot Claire had mentioned earlier appeared. The water became murky with mineral discharge from the thermal vents. Jax's high-tech sonar began to chirp erratically, the screen on his wrist flickering with false readings. He started to drift toward a wall of jagged rock. Claire kicked hard, reaching out and grabbing his shoulder. She shook her head and pointed to her eyes, then to the darkness. She guided him by hand, feeling the subtle shift in the water pressure that indicated a solid object nearby. She led them through the murk like a mother leading children through a dark house. When they cleared the silt, the wreckage of the research vessel came into view. It was a ghost ship, resting at a precarious angle on a ledge. But it wasn't alone. High above the wreck, powerful underwater floodlights cut through the dark. They could see several large, motorized submersibles hovering like hungry sharks. Divers in high-end gear were moving around the hull with cutting torches. These weren't scientists, they were professionals. Mercs. Jax's voice crackled through the short-range comms, sounding like static. They're already inside. We can't take them head-on, Claire whispered into her mic. If they see us, they'll just drop a depth charge and bury the whole site. We have to use the ventilation shafts. They're too small for their submersibles, but we can fit. They moved like shadows, sticking to the underside of the ledge. Claire led them to a jagged hole near the ship's stern, a spot where the hull had buckled during the sinking. One by one, they slipped inside the ship. The interior was a maze of floating debris and twisted metal. Tables, chairs, and loose cables floated in the stagnant water. It was eerily quiet inside the ship, the only sound being the rhythmic hiss of their own breathing. Reed, check the manifest, Jax ordered. Reed pulled up a handheld device. The module should be in the secure lab, Deck 3. But the internal stairs are blocked. We'll have to go through the elevator shaft. As they reached the shaft, a loud thud shook the entire ship. It was followed by a series of smaller vibrations. What was that? Stone asked, his hand going to the combat knife strapped to his thigh. Explosives, Claire said, her heart sinking. They're not trying to find the door. They're blasting their way in from the top down. At the rate they're going, this whole ship is going to slide off the ledge and drop another 1,000 feet into the trench. If that happens, nobody's getting out. We have to move. Now, Jax said. They climbed up the elevator shaft, pulling themselves along the greasy cables. Every time a new explosion rocked the ship, the metal groaned and shrieked. It felt like they were inside the belly of a dying beast. They reached Deck 3 and kicked open the hatch. The hallway was flooded, but an air pocket had formed near the ceiling. Claire popped her head up into the air pocket to save her tank's oxygen. Suddenly, a light flashed at the far end of the hall. 2 divers in black and yellow suits turned the corner. They were carrying heavy-duty underwater rifles. Before they could raise their weapons, Jax and Stone lunged forward. It wasn't a movie fight. It was a desperate, silent struggle in the dark. There was no splashing, just the dull thud of bodies hitting the walls and the silver trail of bubbles. In the chaos, one of the mercenary divers managed to trigger a flare. The hallway erupted in a blinding, magnesium-white light. "Go!" Jack shouted, pinning his opponent against the bulkhead. "Claire, get to the lab!" "We'll hold the hull." Claire didn't argue. She knew the mission came first. She dived back under the water and kicked as hard as she could toward the lab at the end of the corridor. She reached the heavy, reinforced door and saw the keypad. It was dead. No power. She looked at the door, then at the wall next to it. She remembered the blueprints from Vance's briefing. There was a manual override, but it was located inside a small maintenance crawl space. She squeezed into the narrow space, the metal pressing against her tank. It was a tight fit, the kind of space that would make most people scream. She felt her way through the dark until her fingers found a heavy iron lever. She pulled with everything she had. With a slow, grinding noise, the lab door slid open. Claire floated into the room. It was filled with high-tech equipment, most of it smashed. In the center of the room was a small, titanium-reinforced safe. She reached for her belt and pulled out a small thermal charge the team had given her. She placed it on the safe's hinges. 3, 2, 1. A small controlled pop sent a cloud of bubbles into the room. The door fell away. Inside sat a black box, no bigger than a brick, with a single glowing blue light. The encryption module. She grabbed it and tucked it into her thigh pouch, but as she turned to leave, a massive explosion shook the ship larger than any before. The floor beneath her feet suddenly tilted violently. The ship was sliding. "Jax, the ledge is giving way," she shouted into the comms. There was no answer, only the sound of rushing water and the terrifying scream of tearing metal. Claire was thrown against the wall as the lab began to roll. She was trapped in a room that was now falling into the deepest part of the ocean, and her only way out was blocked by a ton of sinking steel. The ship groaned like a living thing in pain. As the research vessel slid off the underwater ledge, gravity took over. Claire felt her stomach drop as the room tilted 45 degrees, then 60. The titanium safe she had just opened broke loose from its bolts and slammed into the bulkhead, missing her by inches. "Jax! Stone! Do you copy?" she yelled into her mask. Static filled her ears. The descent was playing havoc with their short-range radios. Or worse, the shifting steel had cut off the signal entirely. Claire clawed her way toward the lab door, which was now slanted high above her. The water in the room was turbulent, filled with swirling papers, broken glass, and dark silt that made it impossible to see more than a foot in front of her face. She reached the door frame and hauled herself out into the hallway. It was a disaster zone. The hallway was no longer a horizontal path, it was a vertical chimney. Looking down, she saw the glowing remnants of the flare the mercenaries had dropped, fading into the dark as the ship tumbled toward the trench floor. "I'm here," a voice cracked through the static. It was Jax. He sounded breathless. "We're in the elevator shaft. The mercenary divers bailed. They saw the ship was going down. We're trying to climb up toward the stern, but the cables are snapping." "Stay where you are," Claire commanded, her mind working through 1,000 tactical possibilities a second. "The ship is going to bottom out soon. If you're in the shaft when it hits, the counterweights will crush you. Get out of the shaft and into the galley on deck 2. It's reinforced." "What about you?" Jax asked. "I have the module," Claire said, patting the pouch on her leg. "I'm going out through the breach in the hull. I'll meet you at the surface." But Claire knew it wasn't that simple. She was deeper now than she had been in years. The pressure was beginning to squeeze her chest, and her oxygen levels were dipping into the red. She turned away from the lab and started swimming against the rush of water pouring into the ship. As she reached the hull breach, she saw the problem. A massive piece of the rocky ledge had fallen with the ship and was now wedged tightly against the opening. She was pinned inside a sinking tomb. Claire didn't panic. Panic was for people with time to spare. She looked around the flooded compartment. She found a heavy pneumatic rescue tool that had floated out of a locker. It looked like a giant pair of metal jaws. She swam to the obstruction and jammed the tool into the gap between the rock and the steel hull. She pulled the trigger. The tool hissed, its hydraulic arms pushing with thousands of pounds of force. The metal of the ship shrieked and bent, but the rock didn't move. The ship hit the bottom of the trench with a bone-jarring thud. The impact threw Claire against the ceiling, knocking the regulator out of her mouth. For a terrifying 5 seconds, she was in total darkness, sucking in salt water. Her training took over. She didn't flail. She reached out, found her backup air supply, and cleared the mouthpiece. She took a long, shaky breath. The ship was still now, resting on the silt of the ocean floor, hundreds of feet deeper than it was supposed to be. Jax? Anyone? Silence. The radios were dead. Claire looked at her depth gauge. They were at a depth that the modern suits were supposed to handle, but the seals were whistling under the immense pressure. She had to get out, and she had to do it now. She looked at the pneumatic tool again. It hadn't moved the rock, but it had created a tiny gap in the hull just wide enough for a hand. She realized she couldn't push the rock out. She had to blow the hull open further. She reached into her kit and pulled out her last 2 thermal charges. These were designed for locks, not ship hulls. But if she placed them at the structural weak points she remembered from the old Navy blueprints, she might create enough of an opening. She swam to the corner of the room, bracing herself behind a heavy steel table that was bolted to the floor. She triggered the charges. The underwater explosion wasn't loud, but the pressure wave felt like a punch to the chest. A flash of light illuminated the room, and then the sound of rushing water intensified. The hull hadn't just cracked, it had peeled back like a tin can. Claire squeezed through the jagged opening, her suit catching on a sharp edge of steel. She felt a cold prickle on her arm. The suit was leaking. She ignored it and kicked away from the wreck. Once she was clear, she looked up. She couldn't see the surface. All she saw was a faint, ghostly green glow from the submersibles high above. The mercenaries were still there, waiting like vultures to see if anyone survived the crash. She began her ascent, but she had to be careful. If she rose too fast, the nitrogen in her blood would turn into bubbles, killing her before she reached the air. But if she rose too slowly, the mercenaries would spot her. As she drifted upward, she saw 2 dark shapes rising from a different part of the wreck. She pointed her small dive light toward them and flicked it on and off in a specific pattern. The shapes swerved toward her. It was Jax and Stone. They looked battered, their suits covered in silt and scuffs, but they were alive. Jax gave her a thumbs up, his light reflecting off his visor. They were halfway to the surface when the water around them suddenly lit up. The mercenaries had turned their powerful searchlights downward. A motorized submersible began to descend toward them, its mechanical arms extended. Jax reached for his belt, but he had lost his weapon in the crash. Stone was out of flares. They were sitting ducks in the open water. Claire looked at the module in her pouch. This was what they wanted. If she didn't do something, they would be captured or killed right here. She signaled to Jax and Stone to keep rising. Then, she did something insane. She stopped her ascent and began to swim down toward the approaching submersible. Claire, what are you doing? Jax's voice came through, faint and crackly. Keep going, she snapped. I'm giving them a reason to look the other way. She pulled a small, high-intensity emergency beacon from her pack, the kind used to signal rescue planes. She activated it and tied it to a piece of floating debris she had grabbed from the wreck. Then she kicked hard in the opposite direction. staying in the shadows. The mercenaries saw the bright, blinking beacon and assumed it was the divers with the module. The submersible veered toward the light, its cameras focusing on the piece of wood. In that moment of distraction, Claire, Jax, and Stone broke for the surface. They hit the air with a collective gasp, the moonlight blindingly bright after the darkness of the deep. A Navy recovery boat was already racing toward them, its engines roaring. As they were pulled onto the deck, Claire collapsed against the plastic seating, her lungs burning. Jack sat down next to her, breathing hard. "You're crazy," he panted, wiping salt from his eyes. "You know that, right?" Claire pulled the black encryption module from her pouch and handed it to him. Her hand was shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. "I'm not crazy, Jax. I'm just experienced." They looked back at the black water. The mission was almost over. But as the Navy boat sped toward the carrier, Claire saw a flicker of movement on the horizon. The mercenaries weren't giving up. They had ships of their own, and they were closing in. The recovery boat bounced violently over the swells as it raced toward the silhouette of the aircraft carrier. The wind was cold, biting through Claire's wetsuit, but she barely felt it. Her eyes were locked on the horizon behind them. Two fast-moving lights were gaining ground. The mercenaries weren't just searching the seafloor anymore. They were committed to taking back what she had stolen from the wreck. "They're coming in fast," Stone yelled over the roar of the engines. He was manning the boat's communication rack, trying to reach the carrier. "We're 5 miles out, but they have more horsepower. They'll intercept us before we hit the safety zone." Jax looked at Claire, then at the black module in his lap. "If they get this, they won't just leave us in the water. They can't leave witnesses." Claire stood up, steadying herself against the side of the boat. Her muscles ached, and her lungs felt like they were filled with hot coals, but her mind was clear. She looked at the boat. They were in a standard Navy RIB. It was fast, but it was light. Then she looked at the equipment lockers. "Jax, give me the module," she said. He hesitated for a second, then handed it over. Claire didn't tuck it away. She pulled a bright orange life vest from a storage bin and began wrapping the module inside it. "What are you doing?" Jax asked. "That's our only leverage." "They think we're heading for the carrier," Claire said, her voice calm. "And we are. But they aren't chasing the boat. They're chasing the boat. They're chasing the boat." "How far to the kelp forests near the shoals?" Stone checked the GPS. 2 miles to the east, but the water is too shallow there. We'll bottom out." "Exactly," Claire said. "Jax, take the wheel. Head for the shoals. Make it look like we're trying to hide in the rocks because we're desperate." Jax didn't ask questions this time. He swung the wheel hard to the right. The boat leaned dangerously as it changed course, spray hitting their faces. Behind them, the 2 sets of lights adjusted their path instantly. They were taking the bait. As they neared the jagged rocks where the waves broke in white foam, Claire stood at the stern. She waited until the mercenary boats were close enough to see her through their binoculars. She held the orange life vest high, making sure the color popped against the dark water, and then she threw it overboard. The life vest bobbed in the wake, floating toward the dangerous, shallow rocks. "Now, turn back to the carrier. Go!" Claire shouted. The mercenary boats didn't even hesitate. Both of them veered away from the Navy boat, racing toward the orange vest trapped in the surf. They slowed down, their crews scrambling to the bows with boat hooks to retrieve the prize. "You gave it up?" Stone asked, his voice thick with disbelief. 12 years of hiding, a trip across the world, and you just threw it away?" Claire sat down and zipped up her jacket. She reached into the pocket of her diving suit and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was the encryption module. Cold, black, and very real. Jax looked from Claire's hand to the orange vest disappearing in the distance. Then what's in the vest? The hardware store nails I bought back in Oregon, Claire said with a faint, tired smirk. I never got around to putting them in my shed. I figured they'd weigh just about the same as a titanium box. By the time the mercenaries realized they had rescued a box of 20-penny nails from the Oregon coast, Claire and the team were already under the shadow of the USS Enterprise. The massive steel hull of the carrier rose up like a city, and within minutes they were being hoisted onto the deck. Admiral Vance was waiting for them in the hangar bay. He looked at their shredded suits and the blood on Stone's arm. Then, his eyes moved to Claire. She stepped forward and placed the module in his hand. "Mission accomplished, Admiral," she said. Vance took a deep breath, the tension leaving his face for the first time in days. "You have no idea how many lives you just saved, Claire, including your own." "I have some idea," she replied. The next morning, the sun rose over a calm blue sea. Claire stood on the flight deck, dressed in clean gray sweats provided by the ship's store. The air was warm, and the frantic energy of the mission had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of the carrier's daily operations. Vance walked up beside her. He held a folder in his hand. "The transport is ready to take you back to Port Haven. Your truck is still at the airfield. Your house is exactly how you left it." Claire looked out at the horizon. "And my name? As far as the world knows, you're still a gym teacher who went on a long hiking trip," Vance said. He paused, then opened the folder. "But I have another set of papers here. A consultant position. You wouldn't be in the field every day. You'd be training the next generation. People like Jax. They have the tech, Claire, but they don't have the soul. They need someone to teach them how to listen to the water." Claire looked at the papers. For 12 years, she had run away from this life. She had thought that peace meant being ordinary. But standing on this deck, she realized that she hadn't been peaceful in Oregon. She had just been waiting. The chief wasn't a mask she put on for missions. It was who she was. "I have a boat back home," Claire said quietly. "An old wooden one. I promised myself I'd finish fixing it this summer." Vance smiled. "We have a base in San Diego. The water is warmer, and there are plenty of old boats that need fixing in the harbor. Think about it." Claire took the folder. She didn't sign it yet, but she didn't hand it back either. 2 days later, the residents of Port Haven saw Claire's truck pull into her driveway. She spent the afternoon mowing her lawn and saying hello to her neighbors. She looked exactly the same. But that evening, as the fog rolled in, she didn't sit on her porch with a mug of coffee. She went to her shed and pulled out her tools. She worked on her boat for 3 hours, her movements precise and powerful. When she was done, she went inside and picked up the phone. She called the community center and told them she'd be leaving at the end of the month. Then, she opened her laptop and looked at a map of San Diego. She wasn't burying her past anymore. She was using it to build a bridge to a future where she didn't have to hide. As she looked out at the Pacific one last time before bed, she didn't see a threat or a graveyard. She saw a home. The woman who had spent 12 years trying to forget the ocean finally realized that she was the only one who truly knew how to navigate it. She went to sleep that night, not as a ghost, but as a woman who had finally found her way back to the surface.